Okay, if we're ready, we're going to pick up on our next class here on Franciscan history. We've been moving along and pressing forward. We looked at all the Franciscan missions and how the Franciscans have truly and really affected the life of the church in regard to its missionary activity and spreading the gospel throughout the entirety of the world, every continent, every place. And I only covered some of it, and it really was a brief overview of all that the Franciscans have done over these past 800 years. So it's just a small smidgen of what the friars have done and continue to do. So I encourage you to look into some of those that you might find interesting and to see how the Franciscans have affected so many different parts of the world and the church. I want to continue now a little bit from that, talk a little bit about some other Franciscan contributions and how the Franciscans have affected the life of the church and the world. And then I'm going to look at some Franciscan history sources. We're going to go through a bunch of books. So this is kind of the nerdy class where we look at all the historical books and where we find a lot of this information as a helpful starter for those of you who might be interested in doing more Franciscan history and really diving into what the order has been over the centuries. So let's look at some Franciscan prayers, all right? So several friars have written and prompted prayers that have become part of our everyday life. St. Bernardine of Siena composed the "We Fly to Thy Patronage," right? O Blessed Virgin Mary. So that was written by St. Bernardine of Siena. And Blessed Bernardine of Feltre composed the Anima Christi. The Anima Christi was composed by Franciscan Bernardine of Feltre. And Father Joseph of Fermo, a Capuchin, created the antiphon, the Sacrosancte. And then the famous Jesuit prayer also finds its origin in the Franciscan family. It's considered to be a prayer of St. Ignatius of Loyola, but he took it from the Franciscans, the "Take, Lord, Receive." That prayer that Mother Teresa loves so much, that we have in that 1970s song of "Take, Lord, receive all I have and possess." Well, they got that from the Franciscans. The greeting, "Praise be Jesus Christ," was of Franciscan origin, of how the friars would greet one another. And then from St. Francis himself, we learn the beautiful prayer used at every one of the stations of the cross. "We adore thee, O Christ, and we praise you, because by thy holy cross thou hast redeemed the world." Okay, so those are just a couple of prayers that are pretty popular that came as a result of the Franciscan contribution to the life of prayer. Now, contributions to theology, okay? So the intellectuals of the Catholic Church. The Franciscans are, in fact, the intellectuals of the Catholic Church. We like to say we'll bow before the Jesuits. Often think they're the intellectuals and the Dominicans, but really it's the Franciscans. In all humility, we have to be honest. It's the Franciscans who have 3 doctors of the Church from the first order because of their work in theology. The Dominicans, we have Albert the Great, we have Thomas Aquinas, and then you have Catherine of Siena. The Carmelites, you have Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross. The Franciscans, you have Anthony of Padua, St. Bonaventure, and St. Lawrence of Brindisi. And God willing, behind them will be Duns Scotus and possibly Maximilian Kolbe, but we'll see. I'm sure Scotus should be up there considering that he wrote the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. In any event, St. Anthony of Padua is the father of the Franciscan school of theology. St. Anthony of Padua was commissioned to teach theology to the brothers by none other than St. Francis himself. St. Anthony founded the Franciscan school of theology solidly upon prayer. St. Francis wrote a letter to him and he stated, "I give you permission to teach theology to the brothers, so long as you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion." The spirit of prayer and devotion. So prayer and devotion came before the study. So this directive given by St. Francis himself sets that pattern of how a Franciscan is to approach theology. Franciscan theology, or theology as a Franciscan, is not to be studied. It is to be prayed. The prayer of theology is contemplation, or the goal of theology is contemplation. Theology is to be prayed on one's knees before the tabernacle. As I mentioned, the goal of theological studies is not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but for holiness of life, so that one may love God and love the God that he knows. Now, St. Bonaventure, the Seraphic Doctor, St. Bonaventure completed his studies at the University of Paris. He was elected Minister General of the Order after he had begun his student teaching. His works are extensive and impact the church to this day. Most important, his Breviloquium. St. Bonaventure was ahead of his time, having done quantum physics. His impact on the church lasts into our present day. His approach to theology, a theology based upon relationship, is the greatest means for overcoming the dictatorship of relativism. Okay, in the dictatorship of relativism, you present your truth, you present your truth, and that's where it goes. You have what you believe, you have what you believe. And so sometimes in approaching theology simply in the Summa, as St. Thomas does, somebody of the dictatorship of relativism, the relativist will say, well, that's nice, Thomas, that's what you believe. You can prove it all you want, but I believe this. The only thing that this particular generation listens to is relationship. How does it affect my relationship? And so theology needs to be presented in the context of relationship, because that's the only truth that this particular generation understands, is how it affects them in the context of relationship. So theology needs to be presented in that context, which is what St. Bonaventure does, which is what probably made Pope Benedict such a received scholar, is because he is a Bonaventuran scholar. And his presentation, the way he presents the faith through that Franciscan spectrum, certainly assists people to be able to understand in his simplicity and his great depth the truths of the faith. Okay, and we should mention with Bonaventure as well that the new catechism that was published under Pope John Paul II, put together by Pope Benedict XVI when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, is based upon the Breviloquium of St. Bonaventure. And then we have St. Lawrence of Brindisi. He's the Marian doctor, and his English translation has finally been put together as Mariale. It's finally published in English, along with 11 other volumes of his sermons. Unfortunately, very hard to get a hold of, but they are absolutely beautiful. And like I said, his most important work is his Mariale, which is the collection of his homilies that contains the fullness of all Marian doctrine. Okay, other great intellectuals deserving credit for their influence on theology are Alexander of Hales, which I mentioned him in the history of Franciscan history. He died in 1245. So Alexander was a diocesan priest and professor of the University of Paris. He felt called to the Franciscan order, but felt a disdain for the rough wool habit. And in a dream, Alexander saw Jesus struggling under the weight of his cross. He went to help him, but our Lord said to him, "No, if you cannot carry a cross of wool, how are you to carry my cross of wood?" And so when Alexander awoke, he joined the Franciscan order. He's entitled as the invincible doctor, the fountain of life, the monarch of theologians. You like those titles, right? The monarch of theologians, the fountain of life, the invincible doctor. And let's not forget that he was a professor of theology to both Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, his celebrated Summa is the first successfully systematic attempt to make the philosophy of Aristotle subsidiary to the Catholic theology. So he was the first one to grab Aristotle and use his philosophy in the context of Catholic theology. Then we have Blessed Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor, and he was most sought after theologian in Oxford, Paris, and Cologne. He is often referred to as the new Aristotle, the doctor of theologians, or the doctor of Mary, a couple of his titles. The new Aristotle, the doctor of theologians, the doctor of Mary. There's a few of his titles besides the subtle doctor, as he's most known as. His works are presently being translated into English little by little, and they're fantastic. Franciscan Institute Press is publishing a lot of his works. He's wrongly accused of voluntarism and the father of Protestantism. The Franciscan William of Ockham, who did not understand the subtle doctor, did Scotus's theology grave harm. Many people will attack Scotus as being a voluntarist, and that's just not true. Okay, it's William of Ockham who twisted the theology of the philosophy of Scotus and wrongly used it. So he's falsely called the father of Protestantism, or called a voluntarist. He's called the subtle doctor for a reason. You have to be able to understand the subtle doctor as you approach his works, and you have to approach him carefully from understanding Scotus well when you embrace his works. His contributions to theology include the primacy of Christ, that all was created through him and for him, as well as the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. It should be noted that the papal document in Effabilis Deus quotes Blessed Duns Scotus verbatim. So really, the ghost writer of the document approving the Immaculate Conception is 400 years earlier, was Scotus himself. Okay. Now, I want to look at Maximilian Kolbe a little bit. He's a pneumatologist, meaning a theologian of the Holy Spirit. So St. Maximilian Mary Kolbe has been made a tremendous impact on our present culture. Although he is rightly credited as a Marian saint, his specialty was his study of the Holy Spirit, his pneumatology, much like St. Louis de Montfort. Okay? As a pneumatologist, it was for him to explain Our Lady's words at Lourdes, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Mary, spouse of the Holy Spirit being the uncreated Immaculate Conception, Our Lady takes her spouse's name for her own when she says, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Okay, St. Maximilian Mary Kolbe had the largest newspaper in all of Poland, designed to teach the faith and promote Marian devotion. He founded the Militia Immaculata, an organization to promote total consecration to Mary, 3 days after the apparitions of Fatima, when Our Lady told the children that Jesus wanted her Immaculate Heart to be known and loved. He had two very common phrases: "All for the Immaculate," and "I don't see a problem, I see the Immaculate." Those are two great phrases to keep in mind when we run into struggles and difficulties. "I don't see a problem, I see the Immaculate," and "all for the Immaculate." Two great phrases to cling to when we're trying to push forward in living our life. St. Maximilian Kolbe was declared by Pope St. John Paul the Great as both saint and martyr, fulfilling the apparition that St. Maximilian had of the Blessed Virgin while he was still a child. Our Lady offered him 2 crowns, one of red and one of white, martyrdom and sanctity, and she said, "Which do you want?" And he said, "I'll take both." And both were given to him as Pope John Paul the Great declared him both saint and martyr. Now, let's look to, now there's so much more we could say about, the theology of the Franciscans and how they've impacted the church. That would be a whole another course, and we'll get to teaching that course someday and look at how each of these theologians, Anthony and Bonaventure, Scotus, Lawrence of Brindisi, Maximilian Kolbe, and so many others, Alexander of Hales, how they have affected the very life of the church and its theology. But this is just a brief overview that we're doing today. So I hope you get to do some more of that. Maybe we'll do a class on that later on. But right now, we're just going to do that brief overview. We're going to do the natural sciences now. So Father Roger Bacon, he died in 1294. Father Roger Bacon. He's been styled the marvelous doctor. How would you like that name? Marvelous, the marvelous doctor. He is considered the father of experimental science, as he was the first to introduce the method of induction. So the method of induction was given to the world through the work of Father Roger Bacon, who died in 1294, the marvelous doctor. His numerous works include Opus Majus, Opus Minus, and the Tertium. And these works, Father Roger speaks clearly of optical and astronomical laws that are now generally accepted. He discusses such things as the possibility of a steamship, the balloon, the flying machine, the microscope. He explains the composition and makeup of gunpowder. He predicts the invention of the railway, and he predicts the use of electricity. And so here was Roger Bacon in the 13th century, who didn't have the science to do what he knew would someday come about. He foresaw it and knew that it could happen. He just didn't have the technology to do what he knew would be right. And so so I like that: the steamship, the balloon, the flying machine, the microscope, and so forth. And then we have Father John Zamora, who died in 1260, and he was the confidant of King Alfonso X of Spain, and he styled the second Bacon after Father Roger Bacon, the second Bacon. He died in 1260, Father John Zamora. And he was a man advanced in natural sciences. And then we have Father Berthold Schwartz, who lived in the early part of the 14th century, and he invented firearms, and most notable, the brass cannon. So we have the Franciscans to thank for the brass cannon. Oh, the peace-loving, sweet Franciscans. They gave us firearms and the brass cannon. Father Luke Pacioli, Pacioli, Pacioli. He dies in 1512. He was the great mathematician. He was the first to apply algebra to geometry and is thought to have also given the first impulse to the modern system of double bookkeeping. So there you go. These poor friars give us the model system of double bookkeeping. Then we have John Moloch, who dies in 1869, and he was the Bishop of St. John's, Newfoundland, who was the first to conceive of the idea of and showed the laying of a cable in the ocean and thus connecting Europe with America. So he was the first one to give the idea of laying the cable in the ocean. So we have that to thank for the Franciscans too, communication. Father John Somer, an English friar, Somer, S-O-M-E-R, 1380. He lived in 1380. And he was the first to visit the North Pole. So the Franciscans made it to the North Pole first. Okay. Father Marian Veloso, Velloso. He dies in 1811. And he was a distinguished botanist. He styled the Lind, L-I-N-N-E, of America. Lind of America. Said Franciscan missionaries in the past centuries have done for geography, topography, ethnology, and philology, defies adequate treatment of the subject here. What the friars have did on these subjects is just incredible. Geography, topography, ethnology, and philology. It's another word today, philology. All right. They wrote about their travels through unexplored regions and composed innumerable dictionaries and grammars of the languages of the Aborigines, among whom they opened missions. So we talked about all those mission territories the friars went to. They always wrote the topography of it, they wrote about the ethnology of it and so forth, the geography, and they wrote grammar books and so forth of the indigenous languages. And so certainly they contributed on that as well. So then on a quick note, the Franciscans were the first to establish the fire department. So the Capuchins had a lot of input there on the fire department. All right. So we're gonna stop there with the developments because there's so much more we could do, and we only have so much time left in this class. So I encourage you to continue to look up the various ways that the Franciscans have contributed to the church and the world. I just gave us a brief overview, and so I want you to really, as you read and so forth, to really invest yourself to see how the Franciscans have really been such a powerful force for the good of the world and the good of the church. Now, I want to go through some texts here that might be helpful for us understanding Franciscan history. And so some books that I think would be very, very helpful for understanding the role of the life of the friars, the interior struggles, how they lived. The first one I would suggest is Volume 5 of the Works of St. Bonaventure. This is put out by Franciscan Institute Publications. And this is the writings concerning the Franciscan order. The writings concerning the Franciscan order. This is fantastic because this has the constitutions of Narbonne. It has Bonaventure's letter to the 3 questions of an unknown master. It has instructions of novices. It has his letters in regards to the relationships of the Poor Clares, and various other things. But what's great about it is you understand how the friars actually lived in the 13th century. It takes us out of the movie mode of Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and Francis is trampling through the forest, and the friars, down by the river, dunking, leper children into the lake. If you see the movie, you understand. This gives us the ins and outs of the daily life of the friars and how they actually lived. Things like wearing the habit all the time, and why they did things that they did, and what happens if you didn't do what you expected to do. So this is indispensable for understanding Franciscan life and how it was lived, particularly in that first century after the death of Francis, even the first 50 years. And so this is good. Also with this would be the defense of the mendicants, which I don't have with me today, but Bonaventure's Defense of the Mendicants, also published by Franciscan Institute Press. Another great book here by Burr, B-U-R-R, by Penn State Press, called The Spiritual Franciscans. The Spiritual Franciscans. And this will give you a good overview of the Franciscan dilemma with the spirituals and so forth, and all that happened with the spiritual struggle that we saw in the order. So very well worth reading. Very good book on the Franciscan spirituals. Continue on now. This is a classic, and I love this book, because this is just you want good reading of a good historical book of fire and fury, or fight and and so forth. Is Angelo Clareno, The Chronicle of History of the Seven Tribulations of the Franciscan Order. Now, we know that Angelo Clareno was one of those spirituals, one of the heads of the spiritual movement, and his group, the Clarini, continued on, and even after the spirituals were crushed. And so this is great reading on Angelo Clareno's understanding of the Franciscan life and how it was persecuted. So if you really want to understand the spirituals and their struggle to become independent, you need to read Angelo Clareno's works, because he was the guy living it. And so it's a great work. Great work. Now, we talked about the Franciscan Recollects as one of the reform movements that was brought into the observance. And so this one by Philip Yates. I'm sorry. This book here is this. You can get this through. So translated from the Latin by David Burr and Randolph Daniel, and you can get this through Franciscan Institute Press as well. Okay. Now, this would be hard to find in America, because I got it over in Italy. But Philip Yates, The Recollect Franciscan Poverty, History and Legislation of a Stricter Observance Reform. This is a very, very good book in understanding how the Recollect reform, which was a part of the observant reform movement, was brought into the observant reform movement, how they persevered, how they understood the life. Again, these were part of the observant reformers that broke away from the order in 1517, but really well worth the read to understand how they understood the rule and the manner in which they observed the rule of St. Francis with such fidelity, much stronger than the original observance and reform of Bernardine of Siena and John of Capistrano. There's a great little book here. This one's out of print, I believe, which you might be able to get it through Franciscan Institute Press. And it's the relations between the mendicant friars and the regular clergy in England in the later 14th century. It's by Arnold Williams. Now, the reason why I bring this one up is because we talked a lot about the struggles between the diocesan clergy and the friars, and that how much that had to play into the life of the Franciscans in the church and all the struggles they went through. So this is covering the 14th century, so the 1300s in England, but it gives you good insight into the fact that of how they worked together, or at times didn't work together. So another good resource. Another great resource talking about reform movements. We have the Leonine Union of the Friars, Order of Friars Minor in 1897. We didn't talk about this, but over the years after the 1517 split, I did mention how the Franciscans would have, the observants would have other various reforms breaking off from them. The Recollects and so forth, and Peter of Alcantara, the Alcantarini as they became known as, and how that in 1897, Pope Leo brought them all together into one and formed the new Leonine Union. So they had the one Bull of Union, Ite Vos, in 1517, and then a second, which brought all of the reform movements under the same constitutions in 1897, by Pope Leo XIII. So another great historical work written by Maurice Carmody. Okay, no, I found it. Maurice Carmody. All right, now we'll look at another little book here. This is a great little book about the U.S. and how the Franciscans affected the life here in the United States of America. It's called The Cradle of the Catholic Church and the Franciscan Order in the USA. And it's by Reverend Thomas Murphy, OFM. Another great work if you want to read about how the Franciscans influenced the missionary work here in the United States of America. Got some neat little maps in it and everything, really worth reading. Okay. I know this is the boring class, right? This is the class I go through all of my resources or most of them. But if we're going to do Franciscan history, we got to know the sources that we're drawing from. I'm not just making this stuff up out of the hat, that this stuff actually comes from the historical works. Another great book. I like this little one. It's called The Glories of the Franciscan Order. That's how the actual cover looks like. My friend put a cover on this one. But The Glories of the Franciscan Order. This is a fantastic, fantastic little book that really covers Franciscan Herald Press. So they're out of print now, but they're the ones that did this. You probably even can't get this. But this is a fantastic presentation of how the Franciscan Order has really impacted the world and the church. It also covers a lot of the history of the Third Order of St. Francis, and particularly the glories of the Third Order. And here's another book that was published, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe 20 years ago, by Cyprian Lynch, OFM. He edited it. It's called A Poor Man's Legacy, an anthology of Franciscan poverty. And what this is this collection of all these statements about poverty from so many Franciscans over the centuries. And so if you really want to understand what the Franciscan saints thought about Franciscan poverty and how it should be lived, this monster text is certainly, look how thick that baby is right there, right? This is certainly worth reflecting on. Each one of these is not too long. It's a couple of pages. Might be something good to add to your prayer life. Use it during your holy hour to reflect upon poverty and the beauty of our poverty of our Franciscan life. But I love this book, Poor Man's Legacy, an anthology of Franciscan poverty. Well worth the read, and more of a slower read, something to read each day, one of the reflections. Let's look at these three over here now. Some older book by Harold Goad, The Grey Friars. And so this book is a wonderful presentation of some Franciscan life. So it's an older book, but very, very good. Got a lot of good historical stuff in here. Let's turn now to The Roots of St. Francis by Raphael Brown. Raphael Brown, a very famous Franciscan author. Again, this is all by Franciscan Herald Press, out of print. Good luck finding it, the info there. But another great book that talks about Umbria's early Christians, let's see what else we got here. Prologues. Conflicts in Assisi, the Lombard Dukes of Spoleto. So it has got a lot of good outside material that you need for understanding Franciscan life and history. All right, Origins of the Franciscan Order by Cajetan Esser. Another great Franciscan author. You see a lot of books by Cajetan Esser, and he's got a lot of good stuff in here as well. He writes about the beginnings of the new community, the novelty of the Order of Friars Minor, the first crisis, and how they overcame them, the Christian example of the new community. And so this has a lot of good info on the early Franciscans. Okay? So now I want to do some more of the major works here that I think are really important. Let's look at these two first. Well, hold on a second. Here we go. Let's look at these two here. We have Father Lawrence Landini is one of my teachers in Franciscan history, whom I greatly admire. God rest his soul. A beautiful, beautiful man. He wrote a beautiful book called The Causes of Clericalization of the Order of Friars Minor, 1209 to 1260, in the light of the early Franciscan sources. This book is fantastic for understanding how Francis intended the order to be in regards to brothers and priests being on the same level, and then how it became a matter of the priests being the superiors and everything, and the brothers really being the servants. So he looks at the causes of clericalization. We saw how Hamo of Faversham stopped receiving lay brothers into the order, and Bonaventure carried that on and created this clericalism, where the priests were to be served by the brothers, and very few brothers were brought in, and so forth. This kind of covers how that happened. Fantastic, fantastic book. So I deeply, highly recommend it if you can get a hold of it. So good luck, but it's out there. Franciscan Institute Publications has a beautiful book called Evangelical Perfection, an historical examination of the concept in the early Franciscan sources by Lepsensky. I really recommend this book. Another great book on the evangelical perfection and how the friars lived. Okay, and now this is one of my favorite books by the Rome Institute for the History of the Capuchins. But it's a fantastic book by Duncan Nemo on the Reform and Division and the Franciscan Order. He does a fantastic job of going through the Franciscan communities and looking at whether one is lax, moderate, or strict in regards to how one lives the Franciscan life. After reading this, you may examine your life as a friar and say, gee, you know what? I thought I was strict in observing the life, but I'm not. Now, he's not being pejorative by using the terms lax, moderate, or strict. He's looking at the constitutions of various communities and whether or not they're faithful to the rule of St. Francis, the testament of St. Francis, the words of St. Francis, and the example of St. Francis. Okay? So the further one's constitutions or Franciscan life is from the life, the rule, the testament, the example, the words of Francis, that will determine whether one is strict, moderate, or lax. And so Duncan Nemo, fantastic presentation of reform and division of the Franciscan order. You want to understand the fights in the Franciscan order and how we came to them? That's the book. Okay? Now, this book I'm not too big on. John Mormon's History of the Franciscan Order, from its origins until 1517. Mormon is a Protestant, and he does his best to try to understand the Franciscan battle and fight. He gives a lot of historical information, which is beneficial. But he certainly does not side with what I would consider to be the heroes of the order. He tends to be very kind to Elias and very tough on Bonaventure. I don't think he's that. He's very certainly takes his side when it comes to presenting history. But again, a lot of good historical information. I would just question his judgment in regards to the good guys and the bad guys in regards to the life. I think he understands the historical part of things, but doesn't catch the charism and whether or not the actual fight, what it was actually about, and that was really about trying to live the Franciscan life, the charism as Francis gave it. Now, this is an Italian book. Well, it's in English, but published in Italy by Panfilo of Magliano. And it's a sketch of the Franciscan order. So once again, similar to the other book that I just showed you, it's a history of the whole order throughout the centuries. And very, very, very good book. And so it's a good read, good for taking notes and understanding the history of our life. Almost done. 2 more books to go. You hanging in there? Because there's a lot. It's about Franciscan history. If we're going to be able to grab and wrap our mind around what exactly has taken place over 800 years, it takes a few books to grab that, right? You can't just pick up one book and get all in one shot. You need to, have the whole meal, as they say, in order to get a good balanced diet, right? So here's another wonderful book called The Documented History of the Franciscan Order from 1182, which is about the year Francis was born. He was born 1181 or 1182 to 1517. If you notice, these 2 books here, the History of the Franciscan Order and the Documented History of the Franciscan Order, takes us only to 1517, which is where we stopped this class, because from here it kind of proceeds along as normal if you're a conventual or an OFM, where you have 10 years, 11 years after the split, 1517, of the Capuchin reform starting. And so a lot of authors will stop at 1517 because either they don't like the Capuchin reform and they're just OFMs, or they just wanted to give that up to that time period of 1517, right? So, but this is another great work. Again, it's out of print, and it's wonderfully done by Raphael Huber, a conventional Franciscan, and so it's the Documented History of the Order. But again, he also stops in 1517, but does a great job in discussing the history of the order in that time period. But again, he's not going to take you past 1517. So that's why we need to do a separate class on the Franciscan Capuchin history, because many of the Franciscans historians won't take you past 1517. They'll stop there. Unlike our next author. Now, this I consider to be one of the most, you can tell it's well used, right? Beaten up pretty bad because I've used it a lot. It is probably the most comprehensive book on Franciscan history. It's called Franciscan History. That was pretty simple, wasn't it? Franciscan History by Lazaro Iriarte. I-R-I-A-R-T-E. Lazaro Iriarte, and it's from Franciscan Herald Press, I believe, which is out of print. Yeah, Franciscan Hill Press, again, out of print. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic, fantastic read. Because not only does he follow the history of the First Order until the 1970s, from its beginnings to the 1970s, but he also follows the history of the Second Order, the Poor Clares. So he's going to give you the history of the Poor Clares, and he's going to give you the history of the Third Order. And he'll look at the advancements in science and religion, advancements in science and culture and so forth. He'll really look at how the Franciscans have impacted the entirety of the world. And he goes to the nitty-gritty of all the reform movements. Amazing what this man is able to do in 600 pages or so. And he does a great job of breaking down the various Franciscan Third Order groups and First Order groups and the years they were founded and so forth. He does a fantastic job. And I believe this has to be a fundamental textbook for anybody who is even beginning to do Franciscan history. Again, you have to branch off from here to the various fields that he's talking about because you can only do so much in 600 pages. But he really does a great job in covering the entirety of the history of the Franciscan order. He is amazing. And he's a Capuchin. He's a Capuchin Franciscan. So he does take you through the Capuchin reform movement, the OFMs, the conventuals, even their later developments and their reform movements that they had within themselves during that time period. But he also covers, like I said, the Poor Clares and their reform movements, as well as the Third Order and its growth. And it's so well done. I can't speak more highly about this particular book in regards to its resource for Franciscan history. And like I said, eventually he brings us into the 1970s. So he doesn't even stop at, the 1800s or something when the Capuchins were, at their peak. He takes it into the 1970s when things start going downhill again for the order. Looking at the 60s, the 70s, all happened from the Second Vatican Council. Now, again, he's writing at that time, just after the council, so he hasn't seen the past 50 years of what we've seen since the council and what's happened to the order since then. It's very sad when we look to see that the numbers in each of the three major branches of the Franciscan order, the conventuals, the OFMs, and the Capuchins, have dwindled so much. But we do have to cover that part of the history eventually and look at what's happened over these past 50 years. We've become so accustomed to that this is how Franciscan life is, when, in fact, it's really an anomaly from Franciscan life. And so we'll have to look at that more carefully as time goes on. And so that's this book. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful resource on Franciscan history by Lazaro Iriarte. Now, this is just some of my Franciscan history resources. There are many, many others that I didn't bring into the classroom off the shelf because I only have so much space in my arms to carry them. And I need a whole bookshelf behind me to cover all the texts that cover Franciscan history. But these were some ones that I think made a very big impact on me over my years of teaching Franciscan history and studying it. Let me end this class here today, very briefly, because it's going to be a short class today, but let me just say this, that we don't study Franciscan history just for the sake of knowing history. It's not our objective to really learn about Franciscan history so that we can somehow have a good working knowledge of the past, be good museum directors, perhaps be able to just explain things to other people. When we study Franciscan history, we're studying our family lineage. We're studying our life. We're studying our charism. And we're looking to the past to see how it can impact our present. I think I mentioned this at the beginning of our classes, that the Second Vatican Council wanted us to discover the past, to go back to the primitive inspiration. And we have to know what it is first before we can go back to it, to look at it carefully, to see what is the Franciscan charism. How was it lived during the time of St. Francis? How was it lived right after it? What happened over the years? What was good? What was bad? What were actual developments? And what were things that were corruptions of the life? Because the Second Vatican Council wants us to live the Franciscan charism in the way Francis lived it today, right? The church is not saying to simply, grab a Franciscan spirituality, go out and pet birds and go take care of lepers, and then go off to your $1 million homes. The church wants us to embrace our charism to its fullness. So to do that, we need to be able to look at history clearly. The Second Vatican Council wanted us to get rid of those things that we picked up over the years that were contrary to the charism. Things we were doing that were no longer part of Franciscan life, that were anomalies, that were attachments that didn't belong to us. For example, the monastic form of poverty, as we saw through Franciscan history, that was a form of fighting. This this monastic poverty that was adopted by the conventual branch and became norm, and then became part of life, particularly in the 1800s, to all branches of the order. That was not part of our original charism. That's not what St. Francis gave us. And so we need to shake that off to go back to a Franciscan, meaning St. Francis's understanding of poverty, and have the freedom and the willingness to truly embrace it. Anyway, I'm rambling. So what I'm going to do in my next class, God willing, is I want to go through the rule. Because what we're going to see next in our class on Capuchin history is we're going to be looking at how the rule of St. Francis was being re-embraced by the Capuchin reform. And that was the flag document as well for the observance. So we're going to look at all that more carefully on our next class. Okay? So we're going to go through the rule of St. Francis and see more of the details about it and why it was such a source of controversy, and why so many Franciscans, even to this day, have fought so hard to embrace the gift that Francis gave to us, his rule, the gift that he then accentuated by the gift of his testament. Okay? All right, we'll pick up on this in the next class, and that'll be, I think, our last class as we go over the rule of St. Francis. All right? God bless you, everybody. We'll see you next class.